The ICMA Learning Lab is pleased to present this online education program, Rethinking Budgeting, Aligning Budget and Strategy, brought to you by Unisolutions. For technical assistance, please email learning@icma.org. Today's presentation will last up to 60 minutes and includes question and answer opportunity, so please submit your questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. During Q&A, our presenters will answer as many questions as time allows. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Jeff Goldstein, Michelle Kobayashi, and Elizabeth Stewart. Jeff is the Senior Director, Business Product Manager, and Budgets for Unisolutions. He has over 20 years of budgeting, planning, forecasting, and financial management experience in both the public and private sector. Michelle is the Principal Research Strategist for Polco in the National Research Center. She has over 30 years of experience conducting research, surveys, and policy studies for local, state, and federal government, with a strong focus on bringing residents and stakeholders into community decision-making. She has also authored numerous publications on research techniques and has trained hundreds of government and nonprofit workers on data-driven decision-making and evaluation. Elizabeth leads the marketing and research team at Invisio, where she uses her 20 years of experience working with tech companies in the UK and Canada to build awareness among city and county leaders of the advantages of using technology to foster trust and transparency in government operations. She has collaborated with the GFOA for over a year on the Rethinking Budgeting initiative, contributing her expertise to the creation of the RTB Readiness Assessment, an annual survey of local government finance professionals, and thought leadership on aligning budget with strategic outcomes. Speakers, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Julian and ICMA, for hosting. Jeff Goldstein. I'll be taking us through the first part of this and handing it off to Michelle and Liz. And thank you to Michelle and Liz as well for presenting with me today. Very excited to be here. Very excited to talk about this topic and talk through rethinking budgeting. So first one to talk about today, rethinking budgeting, high level, what that is. Michelle's going to talk about the status of local government budgeting. Liz is going to then come on and talk to us about tying budget to strategy and performance. And then I'll bring us home and talking about a strategic budgeting and how to link budgeting to this process as well. So what does it mean to rethink budgeting, right? As we've been hearing this word out, for a while now. GFOA has been, talking about it. Some of these quotes on the bottom here, where the words are directly from Shane Cavanaugh at GFOA. But if I had to kind of break this into three areas, is budgeting now, versus, what we do today versus rethinking budgeting is how do things get funded, or how do we decide what gets funded? And really in a traditional budget now, really past decisions are frozen. It's more of a spend it and get it mentality. A lot of organizations we work with take last year's budget as a starting point, and that becomes their go forward plan for the year, making tweaks to that. But there's not really anything strategic about it. The strategy is really about getting the budget done for the year. The second thing here would be goal achievement. And along that term of budget not being strategic, really the goal is just, allocating funds, getting our budget done for the year, but it's not necessarily tied to a project or an outcome or anything like that. And then finally, improving the process. Traditional budgeting is a zero-sum game. There's not really anything gained or lost in that process. So trying to make the budget process or even the planning process more strategic so that every time you go through that process, that there's value created for the organization that you are, going through that planning process with. And so rethinking budgeting at a very high level, this is the 30,000-foot view, really has kind of, to me, three legs of the triangle. The first one, we'll start down here at the bottom, is community engagement. And so finding out what, for example, in a city, what the citizens of that city want out of their government. What are their priorities? And we feed that into our planning process or strategic planning process each year, where we're setting, and sometimes this isn't year to year, it might be a multi-year plan that we set up, but we're setting our high-level priorities, our goals, and actions and strategies to, to accomplish those goals. So that was in the strategic planning process. And from there, then the third leg would be budgeting. So how do we take these strategies and goals and actions and move them into our budget that we can actually put dollars and FTEs towards our goals and say, here's how we're going to accomplish those goals. Now, at every point, each of these areas is informing the other. So this would be if you looked at this as your annual planning cycle or whatever your planning cycle is. It could be biennial where you're doing this every 2 years. This is constantly improving itself. So, right. So as we finish the budget next year, we go back to the citizens and see have our priorities changed and we could update our strategic plan. So each of this becomes an iterative process for how long your planning process is, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, however long that is. So if we dug in this a little bit deeper into those areas, right, the public engagement, as I said, you want to incorporate the resident or sentiment feedback values into our decision making. What do they want? Also, part of that could be trade-offs, right? Well, if you want to do X, we might need to, limit our budget in Y, or those types of things. And we feed that into that strategic planning process. And like I said before, this is where we're kind of coming up with those community-wide goals. And again, we want to be transparent through this, and how are we going to track this, right? As we go through, and Liz will talk about this, how do we go through and talk about how are we doing against those goals in the strategic plan and measuring performance so we can inform our stakeholders, how we're doing against that plan. And then finally, this strategic budgeting is the third part, which is where we're connecting the dots between all of these areas, right? So what were the goals of our strategic plan and how are we funding different projects to meet those goals as well? So our first poll, we had a poll for you, are you linking your strategic planning process to your budgeting process? And so we'll give you a couple minutes to select where you are at with these answers. Some of our results here. So it looks like about half of you, or a little over half, are linking your strategic planning and budgeting process. And then the second part here is, or I'd say the most of the rest who responded would like to do that, which is great because that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of the presentation today. How do we link these processes together? So thank you for your responses. All right. So as I tee up these, I'm going to bring up Michelle in a couple minutes. I just wanted to go into a little bit deeper on each of these areas, right? So the importance of incorporating citizen engagement. Why would we want to do that? It really ensures that we are planning for the things that are important to our citizens and stakeholders. And by doing that, you foster ownership and trust, right? So people feel like they're engaged within that process, trust, becoming more trusted government, doing the things that our citizens would like us to do and spending the money in the ways that they've informed us that they would like us to. So it also helps boost the legitimacy of our decision making and overall really helps, enhance the impact of our goals and initiatives. So that's why we want to go through that. And Michelle's going to talk about that here in a minute. So the second part is why do we want to, or what does the strategic planning process look like? Why do we do that? I'm not going to read through all these, but really, again, goes back to the third bullet there, stakeholder engagement and input, and taking that engagement input and identifying goals and priorities. So it's really boiling down to here's what we're trying to accomplish over a period of time, and here's how we're going to do that, and being transparent in how we're going to do that. So, high-level goals, objectives, initiatives that we're undertaking to get to those goals as well. So that would be the second part in terms of strategic planning, and Liz is going to talk about that here a little later on. And then finally, the third part is how do we move that and take our budgeting process of traditional budgeting into what I'm calling here strategic budgeting. Again, you see transparency throughout each of these slides, as well as now aligning strategic goals to budgets. So instead of budgeting at just certainly the line item level of, say, supplies, we're now going to link that, budgeting also to one of our goals or our strategies and actions. And so we're moving from kind of traditional budgeting to outcome-based budgeting. We're trying to get this goal or this outcome. And so we're putting dollars in our budget or FTEs in our budget to accomplish that goal. Now, a big thing when we do that is developing also KPIs or key performance indicators for tracking. So what indicators would tell us if we're doing good or bad? If I look at a specific indicator, it should be able to tell me on a specific action how I'm doing against that goal. So we'll talk about that, throughout as well. And again, transparency and highlighting goals, budget allocation, progress, how we're doing is really the biggest thing here is kind of so we can report out how we're doing against our plan. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Michelle, and she's going to take us through a couple of things. One of which is we, as 3 companies, we did a joint survey with GFOA. She's going to talk about the results of that, as well as including that citizen engagement in your planning. Michelle?
Thank you, Jeff. I'm excited to be here to talk about rethinking budgeting and ways for us all to kind of modernize our budgets and be more satisfied and more successful in those endeavors. I wanted to start before I start talking about resident engagement, which is kind of my specialty, but wanted to talk about a survey we did because I think it kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about and what local governments across North America are currently doing. So Jeff had mentioned the three tech companies here today, and Visio, Una, and Polko all worked with GFOA, started a couple of years ago almost now, on this Rethinking Budgeting initiative, and had a conversation at ICMA in 2022 afterwards with a bunch of key leaders and managers asking them about rethinking budgeting and talking about all the technology. And a number of the leaders kept saying, there are so many great tools right now, but our biggest issue is we don't know where to get started. It's almost overwhelming. So the group got together, GFOA and the tech companies, and thought about the idea of creating a readiness assessment. This was be an assessment tool that local governments across North America could use to identify the areas you're strong, your challenges, and if there's some areas you want to move forward with in terms of modernizing your budgets, which would those next steps be? And that tool is going to be released this summer from GFOA. But wanted to talk more about how we developed a survey to start this assessment tool to actually understand the state of the nation. We wanted to find out what are local governments currently doing? What are their biggest challenges? What are the most important characteristics for being successful at budgeting? And then also identify the readiness of organizations to move forward. So we did this survey last spring. We administered it on Polko, our platform. Invitation went out to about 2,000 of GFOA's Distinguished Budget Award winners, and also went out to the GFOA newsletter. And we got about 300 surveys back. And these were often answered by budget officers. And again, it is mostly people that are GFOA Distinguished Budget Award winners. So it's kind of like the high-performing organizations. So the information I'm about to present is really about some of the best people who are doing budgeting right now. Next slide, please. So as part of the assessment, and then thus part of the survey, we looked at three areas of readiness. We looked at what kind of tools people are using, what is their culture, and who are their people, and what kind of skills and human capital do they bring to the endeavor. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the tools, we asked them what they're currently doing to do their budgets. And what we find is about 4 in 10 of the organizations are still using spreadsheets like Microsoft Excel, Access, things such as that. We know about 30% of folks were using a part of their accounting software system. About 1 1/4 are using purpose-built software programs like Una or Questica. And then about 9% are doing other things. Some of these folks are actually using pretty obsolete methods. But again, we're trying to improve that in terms of making people more automated and technologically savvy. Next slide, please. We also asked a few questions about their interest in technology and their existing culture around technology. And what we found is there was a great degree of interest in adopting new technology and people saying they have adequate procurement policies. The areas where we fell a little bit shorter in our organizations across America and Canada is having the resources dedicated for new tech, having the resources dedicated for staff training, systematic approaches to new tech adoption, and flexibility. Those are some areas where we're not doing as well as a nation and would like to improve. Next slide, please. And now let's talk about human capital or people. We asked people how much of a barrier these types of issues were in their organization in terms of getting new technology or actually improving budgeting processes. And what we found is that about 3 in 10 talked about lack of knowledge or support from leaders. About 4 in 10 organizations said their resources dedicated for staff training was a limit. The limited power of the budget staff was an issue, and existing knowledge and skill set of staff were issues. And then the largest barrier we found in the survey was entrenched thinking by longtime employees. So again, and we see this in local government a lot, that there's actually the change culture is not necessarily always there. Next slide. And then the third area we looked at was culture. And now we have some time for audience participation. These are some of the many items we assessed in our survey, asking folks to rate their own culture on these elements. And look at the list right now and tell me, what areas do you think we scored not as well in North America? What areas are we not scoring well in terms of how we rate our organizations? Feel free just to type in the chat. Trust and transparency, 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 fostering trust, outcomes results focus, data, transparency, data-driven decisions, transparency, using data, all of them, welcoming residents, transparency, data-driven decisions, data and decision-making, resident involvement. Great. Thank you. Next slide, I'm going to show the reveal. You can keep typing in if you want. But what we found in terms of organizations, budget officers rating their own organizations, what we found the areas we're doing the best in was being transparent to internal stakeholders. People thought they were transparent to residents. Now, again, this is about your culture in general, not necessarily saying in terms of budgeting. Fostering a trusting relationship between elected officials and staff, commitment to staff development, providing a clear vision, and encouraging collaboration. Where we start to get ratings that are more mediocre is using data in decision-making, willingness to take risks, being outcome results focused, and using your strategic guide to plan work. That's falling below the 50% of organizations who they say they do a good job. And then the area where we see that people rated themselves the most poorly was welcoming resident involvement in decision-making. So all these areas we need to improve in, but you'll see those areas that kind of stand out from our culture. Next slide. We also asked folks to rate the satisfaction of various community stakeholders with the budget process. And what we found is that most folks thought their elected officials, their department heads, and even the budget office staff were pretty satisfied with their current processes. What was more alarming that we found in the survey was, first of all, that more than 1/4 didn't know how the business community and residents, their constituents, felt about the budget or budget process. But for those who did know or had an opinion, barely over a half felt their constituents were satisfied. So again, we're talking a lot about transparency and building trust. And when you find that this budget document, which is arguably one of the most important documents a local government puts out, is not being used to build trust, transparency, accountability, I find that to be a real issue. And I think it's one of the reasons why GFOA kind of started this whole rethinking budgeting initiative. Next slide. And then the final results for the survey, what I want to talk about is just improvements. So we asked on the survey, what is the one thing that your budget or budget process you would change on the survey? But I'd like to ask you all first, if there's one thing about your own budget or your budget process you'd like to change, what would it be? And again, use the chat. If you had a magic wand, what would you do differently? Tool, not using last year as a starting point. Eliminate fluff. Consistency, data-informed process, starting earlier. Community engagement all year round, more simplified. Program evaluation, more community engagement. Have staff that help compile the budget, not just the manager. Use data to drive project budgeting, community engagement, fewer exceptions to rules. And again, keep typing in because it's great for us all to share what our biggest challenges are. Next slide. But I will reveal what we found in the survey from these budget officers across North America. But what we found is, and it's an open-ended question. So again, you're not going to end up with 80% of anyone in one category. In my experience doing open-ended questions. But what we did find is about 1 in 4 were saying their biggest issue is they need improved automation or better use of technology. We found about 1 in 5 wanted greater focus on outcomes, goals, strategic plans. We found about 12% wanted to increase public engagement, be more transparent. And about 1 in 10 wanted to improve or increase staff involvement. That may have been staff being more involved or collaborating better. But some of these 4 issues are kind of the big issues that fell out of these folks as the most important ones affecting their budgeting process right now. Next slide. So that was kind of just a summary of where we are, some of the best budget processes across the nation, and where our successes and challenges are. But I want to move into now kind of my area of specialty, which is involving residents in the budget process. Jeff talked about the importance of this as kind of that triangle he showed. So I want to give you a few ideas on how we think you can best involve residents in the budget process today. Next slide, please. So Jeff already talked about why we would include citizens in budgeting processes and strategic planning as well, as they all tie together. But for us, we talked to about we know that in local government, it is the resident voice that determines who gets put into power, whether tax initiatives get passed, if residents collaborate with you and do what they're supposed to do when you ask for participation. So it really is the bottom line in government. So ignoring it in a really important document and process is not a great idea. It also provides opportunities for civic engagement. We might as well have residents helping us make important decisions. It increases transparency. Again, we're going to hit on this again and again today, but how important it is to be transparent with residents, and the budget is a great place to start. It promotes accountability. And then also, if we work together correctly with residents in a positive way, it actually should improve the quality of your decisions, which is awesome. Next slide, please. But the one fact that we often bring up at Polco is fewer than 20% of residents have ever attended a public meeting, ever. So if you use if the way you communicate with residents and incorporate residents into your budget process is to just present the results of your budget at a public meeting and have comment, you're probably not hearing from a representative sample, and you're likely hearing from people who tend to be more negative, the government watchdogs. They may not be representing the true voice of residents. So we always encourage people to move beyond that public meeting for any kind of community decision making. Next slide, please. So a time for you to type it again. How well do you think you include residents in your budget process? Do you think you do a great job? Do you do a minimal job? What is it that, how would you rate yourself? I see a bad, not at all, not well at all, minimal, medium, not at all, minimal, not at all. We hold sessions, but no one shows up. Medium, minimal, not at all, provide meeting opportunities, get information out there, none, depends on topic. So seeing generally lack of being able to get those residents involved in a productive way. And I know I've been doing this for 30 years and it is challenging and it's becoming less and less challenging, but it has been challenging to try to include them in a way that's meaningful. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about 4 different ways, just quickly, about how you can get residents involved in not only the budget process, but we talk first about getting them involved in the strategic planning process, using their attitudes, their opinions, and their values to inform both plans. So we can use them to help identify the priorities for our plans and budgets. We can ask them to help us make important trade-offs. We can actually provide information to them on how tax dollars are spent. That's a whole transparency issue. And then we also can use their opinions as outcomes when we evaluate our strategic plans and our budgets. Next slide. So I'll give you an example of each. First one here comes from our National Community Survey. But one of the things we often do, and we've been doing for 20 years in collaboration with ICMA, is we actually, communities go in and ask their residents, in the next 2 years, what areas should we focus on? And these are real specific questions. They're broad domains of community livability. Do we care about mobility? Do we care about safety? Do we care about, cable, community design? And we actually ask them which areas the local government should focus on. So again, great for your strategic plan and budget. If all in this community right here, the residents are saying, we want you to focus on the economy, utilities, and safety. We want to make sure that your strategic plan or your budget incorporates that. Next slide. And for me, even better, I actually like to ask residents not only what's important to them, but I want them to rate the quality of those same issues. And then I want to compare those two. And we call this a community livability snapshot here at Polko, where basically we combine importance and quality ratings. And this graph, even though the icons are quite small, what we do with this chart of community livability is we show the areas of community livability, those ones in the clear white level diagonal, those are areas where importance and quality line up. If people think something's really important, they also think that it's high quality. If they're thinking it's less important, it's also less quality. So if you're an economist or someone trying to think about resource allocation, you might think all those areas in that white channel down the middle, you're doing a good job of spending resources in allotment to priorities. That top yellow corner, which is the area we're very interested in, is the critical focus areas. Those are the areas where residents have said it's really important to them and we're not doing a good job. So for this community, it's resident engagement and it's safety. So again, when you're doing your strategic plan or your budget, you'd want to make sure those areas are addressed. We also provide this bottom right-hand corner where actually you might be spending too much energy for the quality. Now, again, that's how an economist or a private sector company might address it. In local government, I know we have mandates and things we have to do, even if folks don't think it's a priority. But again, it also gives you a little bit of idea of how you can maybe align resident expectation with resources. Next slide. We also have a feature within Polko called Balancing Act, which is actually a way to get residents. It's intentionally been built for the last 20 years, putting residents in the shoes of stakeholders, of elected officials and government staff. It's asking them, giving them education, money, and making them either balance a budget, like on the left-hand side of the screen. They do budget simulations where you tell them how much is being spent, what's being spent per person. You might add information, knowledge, saying fire response times or things such as that. And then they actually have to balance the budget themselves. And it kind of makes them do some of that work, thinking about the challenges it is. We also can use it in a more simplified way in terms of, for instance, here we have St. Paul, where they're designing a park, where they say you have $1 million to design the park. Here's how much each of these things cost. Now you help us pick. But we have found that putting people in the shoes of decision makers, not only does it make for better decisions because we can listen to resident priorities and it helps us not all agree on where we need to come together, but also one of the big results we think of having residents involved in these trade-offs is they often leave really having much more empathy for government decision-making, having more respect, feeling like things are more transparent. So it really just improves that relationship of residents with their local governments. Next slide. Transparency, we talked a bit about this. One of the features we have within Balancing Act, and I believe that UNA also has some opportunities to share information back. But even at a minimum, if you're not involving them, help make the decisions, it's really important for them to at least see how you spend the money. And what we do in Taxpayer Receipt is we actually take a budget. We actually ask that homeowners can just get online, put in where they live and also how much their property costs if they own property. And it feeds back how much money per year is spent on different things, such as affordable housing or community planning development. And the thing we found with this process and Taxpayer Receipt is local residents often confuse local government. They conflate it with federal government and state. And what folks often see through this kind of transparency is they're spending a lot less money on items than they think they are. And so this goes a long way for, again, accountability, transparency, and building trust. When they realize they're only spending $9 on parks per year versus when they think it's hundreds of thousands, it's a very big different conversation we have with these folks. And then finally, we have a slide next, on evaluating outcomes. Liz will talk more about this, but one of the things I think about, given that resident opinion is like the crown jewel of outcomes for me, looking at what residents think, how they feel, we've seen folks starting to take the information we get from their initial survey, like the National Community Survey, and then when they decide to do a strategic plan or budget around that strategic focus area, we like to then see them put the data back into the budget or the strategic plan or the performance measurement system and saying, we decided this was an issue we wanted to work on. We're going to come back 2 years later, ask residents again to tell us how they feel about our community or our services or what's going on. And we use that as performance measures. And therefore, our budget and our strategic plan become more living documents. They're able to react. Oh, we're doing a great job in this. The program's working well. Let's double down on it. This program's not working as intended. Maybe we need to hone the program or change it. Or maybe this program isn't working as expected at all. Maybe we need to trash this program. But again, it's a great way to demonstrate what you're doing, be accountable, transparent, also being able to use data to drive performance. This is an example from Denton, Texas in Invisio. And again, Liz will talk more about it. But again, just a great best practice for folks to start to take that resident opinion and use it for performance data as well. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Liz to take the link from resident engagement to strategic planning.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to try and gracefully take the baton here from Michelle and talk about what comes next. So let's say you've done your amazing work with your community. You've come up with this list of priorities, affordable housing, recreation and culture. You've got your priorities. How do you now take those and turn them into an actionable plan, a living plan? And how do you tie that plan to your budget process and to your performance management process? So next slide, please, Jeff. Okay, so this is my version of Jeff's earlier slide. I thought it might be useful to revisit it at this point in the webinar, about halfway through. So the rethinking budgeting cycle is really community engagement that Michelle's been talking about for the last 20 minutes, and how that community engagement feeds a strategic plan, how that strategic plan informs the budget process. And then my extra little sneaky bit that I put in this diagram, Jeff, was that I pulled out the performance management piece. So for anyone who's very familiar with the rethinking budgeting work of the GFOA in partnership with the ICMA and NLC, you'll know that those documents talk a lot about reporting and the importance of reporting back to the community, back to elected officials and staff. And so for my diagram, I just pulled out that performance piece because we are going to talk a little bit about tying budget to both strategy and performance and really completing this full cycle with transparency all the way around. Next slide, please, Jeff. Okay, so why tie together strategy, budget, and performance? So these are sort of the four main points that I wanted to pull out. The first one's pretty obvious. Of course, we want to drive better community outcomes. That's what we all want. That's why everyone's on this call. And really, we want to be able to focus activities on the key priorities as an organization and ensure that they're actually delivered. So that's where the performance management piece comes in. We want to be able to make better decisions. This is the whole point of the performance management program. We want to know if we're going to reallocate budget, was it a good use of the money? How are we being effective in our delivery? Why did things fail? Why did we succeed? And importantly, what do we do next? So a key part of all of this I'm going to talk a lot about is organizational agility. A lot of the rethinking budgeting best practices are about how do we get more agile as public sector organizations. in our budgeting processes, in our plans. And so I'm going to sort of challenge some of the traditional strategic planning practices as well as some of the traditional budgeting ones in here. And of course, we all know we need to build more transparency. We need to build more trust in our communities. I think it's probably the most overused buzzword right now in local government and GovTech, but for a reason, it's important. Next, please, Jeff. Okay, so Michelle gave some great insights about the local government budget survey that we collectively put together as 3 companies. And that's a fantastic survey. It was really useful in creating the readiness assessment that Michelle talked about. But a lot of that came from the budget office lens. As Michelle mentioned, those were the distinguished budget award winners from the GFOA predominantly that took that survey. So it was really looking at the status quo of budgeting and some of the challenges in that budget process. So I'm going to look a little bit more from the strategy and performance lens. That's sort of our expertise from Invisio, some of the challenges in strategy and performance and tying that to budget. And then hopefully how we address some of them. So my goal is to kind of give you a few aha moments that we've learned along the way and hopefully challenge some of the way kind of we think about strategic planning and strategy execution. So I like to start, oh, sorry, Jeff. Thank you. I like to start with this number because it's kind of a shocking number. This 80% of public sector leaders self-reported back in 2021 that their organizations struggled to successfully implement strategic initiatives. So this is sort of a 3-year-old survey. And we see a sort of a similar trend in our customer base. So next slide, please, Jeff. So bear in mind the work that we do at Invisio, by the time we're working with cities and counties, they're already somewhere in the sort of strategic planning process. So generally when local governments come to Invisio, they've already got kind of their priorities sorted. They've usually got a fantastic vision statement. They've done a lot of work with their elected officials and their communities to really kind of establish those strategic levels of their plan. But even in this case, we find that almost 2 out of 3 organizations come to us without a plan that can actually be operationalized. So it's still not ready to execute. And so it can't be actioned today, and it's not a living plan for the future. So next slide, please, Jeff. And so what do I mean by that? What does an operational plan need? So what we find is that often organizations come to us, and the first piece is that there's no defined actions to implement a strategy. So the top 2 levels of the plan are beautifully thought through. There are priorities, but there are no defined programs and actions to actually execute. Because there's no actions, there's often no resource reallocation that's happened, because usually that resource reallocation is happening at that action level. So there's been a business as usual budgeting, and there's kind of that disconnect between the high level strategic planning and the budget process. There's often no measures of success, or there's some measures being collected somewhere, but they're not tied together. And so there's no way to evaluate the success of budget reallocation. There's no way of being able to pivot if things are not working well. There's no agility, and there's no process for reporting progress, either to the community or the staff or elected officials. There's no kind of consistent cadence. And that reporting piece is really an important mechanism for ensuring that things actually get done and the right things are getting done. Reporting is really key to bringing together all of the strategy execution pieces. And we often find that any kind of reporting that's happened is incredibly manual. And as a result, it often doesn't happen consistently, or things are hidden in the process if there are bad results. So these are kind of the four things that we see. A lot of the reasons that strategic plans never get off the ground, and all the work that goes into identifying community priorities often don't end in the outcomes that are being identified for priority. So Jeff, next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so that's the negative. Let's talk about the positive. Let's talk about how we go from vision to reality. So it's really 5 steps. We call this our planning and performance framework. And it really starts with obviously that strategic planning process, creating those 2 high levels of the plan, and going all the way from those set of priorities identified all the way to actual results. So like I said, I'm going to talk about each one of these steps in a little bit more detail and some of the best practices and how they all tie together. So we'll talk a little bit about the vision and the goals and the definition there. We're going to talk about then how you align actions with those visions and goals, how you tie that into your budget process. Then an very important piece, monitoring as well. So are we having the desired effect? Are we executing effectively? And then we get into progress reporting. And once you get into this point of regular, consistent progress reporting, this is when you really see data-driven governance and you really see a focus on organizational transparency. And then, of course, ultimately, you get to the outcomes. When you're really effectively executing on your strategy, you have a very refined performance management program. Okay, next slide, please, Jeff. Okay, so I'm going to take each one of these 5 steps and quickly talk about some best practices. So I'm going to start by giving a little bit of a shout out to the GFOA's white paper on rethinking strategic planning. It's a great document. If you haven't read it, it covers a good chunk of what I'm going to cover here, some of the best practices, some of the challenges with traditional strategic planning and how we can address them and tie it into a more modern budgeting process. So I'm going to start, when I talk about strategic planning, I'm really talking about these top 2 goals and strategies. That's our nomenclature at Invisio. You can have a vision statement above this as well. So these top 2 levels of the plan, we really advocate for being the multi-year levels of your plan, 2 to 4 years. Traditional strategic planning would often be like you had your set plan, every single bit of it was set for 5 years, nothing changed until you get to the end of that plan. But really what we see as effective now, and the way to tie your strategic plan to your budgeting process is at the top 2 levels of the plan in multi-year. Those are the pieces that you identify with your elected officials, with your community. And Michelle talked about a lot of the benefits of community engagement. The other piece that we see is if you do that work at the foundation to really engage the community, your top 2 levels of your plan are much more likely to survive any change in your elected officials. And then the action level, that 3rd level of the plan, is really, that needs to be refreshed much more regularly. So I've said 1 to 2 years here. We really recommend annually that you tie that to your budget process. And that's what makes your plan a living plan. So your plan is only remains operationalized as long as the actions remain relevant. And then the one other big piece, and I think there's been 2 trained schools of thoughts in this for a long time, but your strategic plan really should just contain your transformative work. So not everything that your organization does. It's really those priority areas where you need to make transformation, where you're trying to drive a different outcome. Okay, Jeff, next slide, please. Okay, so operational planning best practices. This is where we start to see this 3rd level of the plan come in. So we always talk about these as 2 separate things. Of course, they're all tied together in one plan. You need a strategic plan and you need an action plan. It's your actions that need to be supported by budget, and that's where that piece needs to be refreshed regularly as well. One of the reasons. And then your actions need to be smart. and probably telling people obvious things, but they do need to be specific, measurable, achievable, resourced, which is where the budgeting piece comes in. I know sometimes people use that R and say it's relevant. We very much look at it as resourced. If there's no resourcing to your action, it's not going to happen. It's very unlikely to, and time bound. And then a really important piece is at the action planning level. This is where your departmental staff must be engaged in creating the action plan. They have the expertise. They're going to be the people responsible for actually delivering the actions. And so they need to be engaged at this point of your planning process. And they should also be engaged in creating their performance measures. So next slide, please, Jeff. So I'm going to talk a little bit about performance measurement best practices. We've talked a lot about outcomes, and I want to talk a little bit about the difference between outcomes and outputs and the importance of having both. So the example that I've put here, I've sort of given you one example of a goal, strategy, and action, and a KPI underneath. Obviously, goals can have multiple strategies can have multiple actions can have multiple KPIs. One of the things that we see a lot is that a big push towards everyone should be measuring outcomes, and that's absolutely true. Outcomes are a really important piece of performance measurement because ultimately it's what we're trying to achieve. My example here is actually what we'd consider an output, and a number of new trail miles constructed. So, your outcome in this particular example might be resident satisfaction with quality of life. You want to see an improvement in that, and that's your outcome measure. Or you want to see an increase in the number of people who walk to work because you've created more connected, more safe and walkable communities. But that takes a while to measure, as Michelle was talking about, annual surveys. And the leading indicator in that case is the number of new trail miles that you've constructed. So we really do advocate for having outputs and outcomes at your plan, and often the outcomes measures will sit a little bit higher up and next to your strategy, and your outputs are going to sit underneath your actions. But the most important thing is to have performance measures that are actually effective, that allow you to tell a story, understand what's happening, justify future budget reallocation, address obstacles early. This is a huge one. A lot of our customers say to us that a big piece of reporting and performance measurement is actually understanding when things are going sideways early so that they can be addressed or changed, and they can pivot as needed. And monitor results. If your performance measures aren't doing that, then they're not effective performance measures. They have to be doing one of those things. And then the big piece there is like try not to measure absolutely everything. So we sometimes have local governments we work with that are like, we want to put every single bit of data we've ever collected in our strategic plan. It's 400 measures. And then obviously we have to go through a process of being like, what's actually going to help you tell a story and understand what's happening, because you can just get lost in the trees with performance measurement. Next slide, please, Jeff. So reports, dashboards, transparency. I just kind of wanted to close the loop a little bit. I did talk about the importance of reporting at the start. Reporting is really that piece, that mechanism that's going to drive continuous improvement. It's going to drive what we consider a culture of data. It's absolutely critical. Just some best practices when thinking about reporting, and I've got a nice little example on the screen as well. You want to make sure you include qualitative and quantitative information in your reports, as well as trying to link to your like budgetary information. Data needs context, and so particularly when you're reporting out to audiences that don't necessarily understand the metrics as well as you, so out to your community or maybe your elected officials, you want to make sure that you've got narrative in there as well as just a bunch of numbers. And then importantly, the good and the bad. One of the challenges with talking about accountability, and notice I've tried not to say accountability at all in here, is that if people feel that like reporting is going to be used to poke holes in what someone's doing or say someone's not doing their job, then you're never going to get to true transparency. So reporting should be seen as something to help the organization and help make good decisions, not to point fingers. Regular, consistent cadence, of course, and then importantly, decide how you're going to use your reports throughout this process. When you're going to report at different times, typically we'll say quarterly against a strategic plan. That would be usually our recommendation, but different audiences need reporting at different times and different types of information. Next slide, please, Jeff. I just want to show a quick example of an organization doing this really well. This is a public dashboard. This is from the city of Albuquerque in New Mexico. I couldn't even put the whole dashboard in here, but they've got their budgetary information on this dashboard. It is tied to one of their strategies. They've got a scorecard, which really tells the story of like their outcomes and where they're trying to go and how they're doing against it. And then underneath, they also have written narratives from staff, like how are they actually doing against different action items that are sitting under this strategy. Next slide, please, Jeff. Okay, and then so just some final thoughts here. I think whenever we talk about rethinking budgeting, I think it can feel a little bit overwhelming. Like, where do we start? Our organization could never do this. This is, you know, there's too many challenges, too many obstacles. So our kind of motto as a team is think big, start small, make progress. That's the most important thing. This doesn't have to be an absolutely perfect process. I kind of showed that 5-step framework before. We often work with local governments, or they have some performance measures and they've got a bit of a strategic plan, or they've just got a vision, or they've got bits and pieces, and they're kind of slowly sort of piecing it together to get to their ultimate goal, which is kind of this, you know, really robust strategy execution and performance management process that's all tied to the budget. But it's rarely linear. Agility really matters. Plans need to be living plans. Don't just kind of make a plan and then put it away and be like, well, that's done. Employee engagement is obviously critical. We didn't talk about that a huge amount, but strategic planning, action planning, implementation, they are a team sport. And Michelle talked a little bit about the importance of engaging all employees at different points of this process, and some of the challenges that were reported in the budget process. But yes, this is rethinking budgeting is an organizational piece of work. It's transformative for the organization as a whole. It's a team sport. And with that, I think I'm handing back to Jeff to talk about strategic budgeting.
All right. Thanks, Liz. That was great. So I'll bring us home. So really, how do we move from strategic planning to strategic budgeting? So we'll have another poll question here. And this is more about trying to get to what is the status of your strategic plan? And do you have one, and how you're linking that to your budget? So I'll give you a minute to respond to that. All right. So it looks like about a quarter of you currently don't have a strategic plan. That's fine, but hopefully we give you some reason to start one in the future. About 32% have a strategic plan, but you're not necessarily using it to link to your budget. And about 43% of you are linking your strategic plan to your budget. So, okay, thank you for your responses. That's great. So I'll take us through kind of now the reasons why you would want to link that to the budget and how you accomplish this. So we've talked about the pillars today, again, just to bring us back to those three pillars of public engagement, strategic planning, and strategic budgeting. We've talked about the top two. I'm going to talk about the third one. And this is really moving your budgeting to an outcomes-based budget where you're linking budget line items to strategic goals, initiatives, or as Liz said, really kind of that action level of what you're doing. So what we're going to see in, for the next couple of minutes is how do we take all these things in our strategic plan and those levels of our strategic plan and move them and operationalize them in our budget. So why would you want to do this, right? So we go through really this whole process of community engagement, strategic planning, and we want to tie that into our budgeting process. All these things really need to be done together. Now, some organizations, as we just saw in our polls, right, aren't doing maybe a strategic plan, or they're not linking their plan to the budget. Really, and sometimes it's even two different departments or people doing a strategic plan versus the budget or being responsible for that in an organization. But really, why wouldn't we tie these things together, right? So that everything kind of has that common thread of our planning process behind it, even though we might be doing different things at different points in that planning. So one reason is kind of optimizing resource allocation, right? And we're all kind of pulling towards the same direction and goals to really, put all of our energy into specific things within that strategic planning process and applying those same principles to our budgeting process. We talked also earlier in the presentation, you kind of really heard this throughout, is increased accountability and transparency. So by doing this, and as we look at things, or say residents start looking at our strategic plan or our priorities, that ties into now we're really putting our money where our mouth is in terms of where are our budget dollars going towards. And we can confidently say with a process like this that, okay, we are trying to accomplish these goals from our strategic plan, and here's what we're doing to accomplish those goals in terms of budgeted dollars or FTEs going towards that particular goal. And then really goal alignment, as we're talking about, and performance evaluation. Liz did a great job kind of talking about that, is really not only having those financial objectives, but having those measures and mechanisms to be able to tell us how we are doing in filling these mandates or these goals throughout our process. So the outcomes of a strategic plan, and Liz touched on this, and we're going to talk about this using the same kind of wording, but usually from a strategic plan, if you have one, you generally have different layers of that plan. And generally, I'll talk about this today as like 3 different layers. And you can call them whatever you want, but they go from left to right in terms of highest level to the lowest. And here you have your goals, right, which would be your high level goals. So I want to have civic excellence, or prove that in my economy, I want that to be better, or build community. And then you have underneath that is strategy. So how are we going to get there, kind of those pillars of things that we're trying to have in terms of a strategy to get to those goals. And then underneath that would be actions, right? Now, these are the areas of specific things that we're doing to meet our strategies and ultimately meet our goals. And the action level is generally where you would budget at. And the reason for that is you can always roll up, right? So if I budget at the lowest level, I could always say, okay, how does that roll up to an overarching strategy? Or how does that now roll up to our overarching goals as well? So these are the outputs of any strategic plan. And these are the things that you would work into our budget software to be able to budget at this level. So to kind of break this down a little bit further, you have a goal right here in our orange circle here. We want to reduce homelessness. And then you have your strategies underneath that. So you might have a couple of those. And under each strategy, then you're going to have specific actions. Now, each of those actions is where we will have budget allocations, right? So you'll have specific actions. You'll have KPIs to track each of those actions, ideally. But you'd be able to roll up and say, how does that affect the strategy, and how does that affect the goal as well? So just kind of putting this in a picture format. When we break this down into our budgeting, going from a strategic plan to a strategic budget, is now connecting those goals or strategies or actions, and as we said, we're going to budget at the action level to be able to put dollars to each of those things, right? Or FTE. So we're going to be attaching essentially these particular actions to budget line levels. So within our unit budget platform and our Questica platform, so unit budget powered by Questica, we have the ability now to tie that into budgeted dollars, right? So if you look here on the left in terms of here, you would see generally you're budgeting at an account level. Let's just call it that for today's illustration. And at that account level, you'll not only be able to budget dollars, but you'd be able then to tie that on the right to specific actions, right? So these are the outputs of the plan. You'll be able to say, okay, I'm going to budget a certain amount of overtime, and that ties to a specific action of evaluate and maintain our municipal assets. You would also want the ability to tie things in terms of FTEs to actions, right? So I could say this particular position is going to be tied to a goal, and you could split these amongst multiple different actions as well. And then ideally also would have KPIs for tracking, right? So these are the things that we want to track that tell us how are we doing towards meeting that action or strategy or goal. So you see some examples of that of KPIs. So all these things are happening during your budget development. You could also tie these things, I didn't have a picture here, to your capital budget projects as well. But the idea is, again, you're tying specific budget dollars to specific actions. Now, we could always roll that up, right? So through reporting now, if I'm budgeting at that lowest action level, I can now always report up. So this is just an example here, both from budgeted dollars to FTEs at the lowest levels, right? So you see plan level 3 being that lowest level. That's kind of the individual line items that we're budgeting for, but I could always roll it up, in this case, to my strategy of environmental health. And then how does that roll up to our overall goal of civic excellence in this case? So you can always roll up if you budget at that lower level. Same thing on when you're rolling this up, here on the right, a couple other things here in terms of rolling that up. If you just looked at it, without the detail is the second one, without the account level detail. Now, same things in terms of FTE allocations, right? So you'd be able to do this type of reporting again, specific, departments, specific, even positions, and specific FTEs now being tied to each of those levels of a strategic plan as well. So here's an example just of some rolled up reporting of that. So these are going to be the outputs now of the types of reporting that you'll be able to get to support your strategic planning process and to support your strategic budgeting process. So we've done all this work now to break that budget into these specific levels. How do we report that out, right? And the importance of reporting and transparency out to the public, right? So we want to be able to create a document that's accessible to the public, where we can easily highlight goals, strategies, actions, and show the linkage to those budget dollars, right? We did all this work. How do we convey this out to the public? How do I turn data into information? And that's really what a budgeting process is. We have all these line item granular details of a budget. How do I turn that into information that tells a story? And that's something we're going to want to do as well, going back to kind of our goal of transparency and communication as well. And then we need to be nimble and flexible. And Liz talked about this as well. Things are changing so rapidly. So from year to year, right, we need to be able to change, right? So our priorities might change, the way that we update things. Maybe our KPIs are changing because something becomes more important to be able to track or something like that. So we need to be nimble throughout this process. If you remember going back to the triangle slide that I had in the beginning, this is an annual process, or whatever your planning process timeline is. This is always feeding in new information into that process, and we need to report this out and be transparent. Now, how do we do that? If you think about a strategic plan, or if you have a strategic plan, you probably created one, might have worked for a graphic designer to create that. But we're moving away, and you've heard this even in your budget book discussions, right? Everybody's really trying to move away to some degree, not just from print, but to make things digital, accessible, online. create an interactive document. So as part of Unibudget, we have an open book platform. As part of that, we have Budget Book Studio to be able to create both budget books. But if you really think about a strategic plan, the strategic plan is very much like a budget book, where it has some narrative and things like that. So on the left-hand side here, I have just kind of the table of contents of, things commonly found in a strategic plan. And to the right is just an example maybe of a page of a plan where we're bringing in a specific goal, and then we're, kind of have some narrative about that goal. That could, quite honestly be kept also in your budget system, some of this narrative, or it can be written into a strategic plan in our software. But you could also now tie all of this narrative and this goal to specific data from your budget. So there's just an example now of visually creating data that came out of that planning process where you're tying that back. So you can see this at a higher level of maybe, an income statement level of like salaries and benefits and contracted services, but you could also now get the details of your specific plan all the way down to the account level of how much we're spending, on a specific program or something like that. So again, in creating a strategic plan, the idea is to make this digital and interactive. So these type of visualizations would be things that, whoever is going to visit that plan can now click on and get more details and let them kind of drive how they'd like to look at this data. And this is really about turning that data into information, and this information would tell a story of how we're breaking our strategic plan into specific goals, strategies, and actions that now have budget dollars associated with them. One last piece of this is also tracking some of those KPIs. Liz went into this as well, but just another example here of how do I track some of those performance indicators, and you can do this as well as part of your plan. So you can come in and say, okay, here's how we're doing versus our goals, or here's our statistical measures now that support how we're doing as well. So those would be the pieces that come out of your budgeting process, and then these would be the pieces that you'd want to create a strategic plan to now highlight how we're spending our money as well. Just one slide for concluding thoughts, and then we'll take questions. Is really takeaways from today, right? And going back to everything we've talked about today, is engaging with the public to inform our priorities. And so from that public engagement is, what does the public feel, or what are the things the public feels we need to focus on? Build a living strategic plan with those priorities in mind. So as we set our goals, strategy, and actions, these are the things that we have gotten as priorities from our community. And then connect that strategic plan with your budget. So we went through this long process of creating a strategic plan. We spent all that time to come up with those priorities. We engaged with the community, came up with this great plan. Well, now how do I link that with my budgeting process? So those aren't two separate processes. So those processes should be connected, as I just showed you. And then at the end, be able to be transparent with your plans, result, and progress, and either do this in terms of transparency, if you have a way to report that out, or through the creation of a strategic plan, as I showed you on our digital budget book type of software, and that allows you to create that digital experience of that strategic plan. So with that, we will take questions. We have about a couple minutes, and please put your questions in the chat.
Thanks, Jeff. Looks like we already have one, and that's what tool is being represented here? And I believe that was under the budget connection to plan slide.
I have this under me. So what I showed, in terms of here is Unibudget, powered by Questica. So this would be in the Questica platform. And the outputs of the plan really could come from anywhere. You could, if you're working with a Visio, those can come from the Visio software. If you already have a strategic plan, those 3 layers that I showed could just be things that you bring that you can put into the budgeting platform.
Thank you. Feel free to submit any questions via the Q&A panel or the chat. While we wait for any of those to come in, did any of you have any final thoughts?
I can speak just to say that I am super excited to finally see the advances made in the field of budgeting, not only just the tech, but also the interest, and GFOA really spearheading this movement, because working with local government the last 30 years, I feel like budgets have been very underutilized in terms of transparency, outcome orientation, all those types of things. So super happy that this is all happening now for us all to engage in.
Yeah, and I was blown away by 55% of the audience who said that they do use their strategic plan to guide their work. So I was super encouraged and excited to see that.
All right, looks like we do have another question in here, and it's how do we minimize budget overrun?
I know about minimize budget overrun, but I think you take that right back to the goals and objectives, right, of the strategic plan that we're budgeting at, right? So it isn't necessarily did we overrun the budget, is we set aside a certain amount of budget to accomplish this goal, holding yourselves accountable to the spend of that for this year. And as we talked about, being nimble, where if we need to put more budget into that, we can do that next year possibly as well. So whether you're rethinking budgeting or strategic budgeting, right, budget overrun is more of a, how am I controlling my budget internally? But I think where my mind goes to answer that question is, in the rethinking budgeting world, us being nimble is we would, not necessarily overrun the budget this year, but if we find that that's a strategic priority or need to put more dollars to that next year, we can be nimble enough to make that pivot in our next budget cycle.
Gotcha. Thank you. And I'm not seeing any other questions, so with that, we must conclude today's webinar. A special thank you to our presenters and to everyone who joined us today, and we hope we'll see you again soon. If you had any questions in the future, feel free to send them to learning@icma.org so we can forward them along to the presenters. Please take a moment to complete a brief evaluation of today's program by returning to the ICMA Learning Lab page where you logged in today. The survey must be completed to unlock your certificate for this program. After completing the survey, you can access your certificate via the Achievements tab at the top of the interface. A recording of today's session will be uploaded to the same place you found the Zoom link in the Learning Lab, along with the slide deck in the Additional References tab. Today's program is copyright 2024 by the International City-County Management Association with all rights reserved. This concludes today's program. You may now disconnect.